On the 14th of February, St Valentine's Day, 25 local people gathered to hear about what makes Cwm Cynfal so special and how it would be threatened if the proposed hydro scheme goes ahead. Here's something of what they heard.
Everybody, thanks very much for coming together this morning to join us on this walk. I just wanted to say a few words about the Cynfal here. So, Cwm Cynfal is one of the best and most impressive waterfalls in Britain. It comprises a series of 14 waterfalls with a fall of 105 metres just in this upper section of the gorge. This ravine has been carved out of the granite by the force of the water flowing off the Mignite, originally from the glacial meltwater of Eryri. The upper half of this gorge is open like the Mignite, consists of mountain crag and friedd, upland grassland. And this area we're going to walk through today is the SSI Cwm Cynfal. The lower half is Atlantic coast oak woodland or Celtic rainforest, which is temperate rainforest and is equally as precious and endangered as the tropical rainforests we hear so much about. And the lower part of the gorge is the SSI Cainant Cynfal. In both sections of the gorge, rare and precious communities of mosses and liverworts, known collectively as bryophytes, ferns and lichens, thrive in the humid conditions, not just because this is an area of high rainfall, but because of the high humidity created by the spray from the tumbling river and waterfalls. The degree of humidity is dependent on the amount of spray, which is in turn dependent on the volume of water flowing down the ravine. These plants together are known as lower plants, but not lesser plants. It is really important to have and to maintain these communities of lower plants, not only because they are a measure of air quality, but because they slow down the release of water into the ecosystem. The moss-rich bogs of moorland act as a sponge, holding huge quantities of water, helping reduce the peaks and troughs of river flow, and therefore helping reduce the risk of flooding downstream. They create whole small-scale ecosystems of their own, sheltering and feeding tiny invertebrates, which in turn feed the birds. And they trap the sun's energy through photosynthesis, locking up carbon in the process to create these rare and beautiful plants. There are 1,700 species of lichen in the UK, 1,400 of which are found here in Wales. So Wales is massively important for the biodiversity of lower plants, largely because of the huge variety of habitats found across Wales. We've been kindly lent some hand lenses today by Tracy Lovering and delivered to us for us to use to get a glimpse into this other world, not normally or so obviously visible to us, a whole other smaller scale ecosystem that exists but which is equally as important and beautiful. So today we'll be focusing and thinking about the macro and the micro, the large scale ecosystem of the Cwm, the valley and the ravine and its majestic waterfalls, but also the much smaller scale ecosystem of the ferns, bryophytes and lichens. So I just encourage you all today to have a look as you're walking along. We've got hand lenses, get an eye into that smaller scale world. Tracy painted this amazing picture for me that said, that was saying you might find a tiny little invertebrate on a piece of moss, but with a hand lens it can look like a woolly mammoth ploughing through a thick forest. So I think today to me seems about the macro and the micro. We've got the majesty of this incredible landscape, this incredible waterfalls, ravine with this series of waterfalls, but also part of what is really precious here is that there are these communities of lower plants growing hidden in the gorge on the vertical walls of the waterfalls, which are really precious and which would be really at risk from any change to the hydrology and the ecology of this environment. Thank you.
Loads of other people have explained what's so special about this place. This is a valley which is mentioned by name in the Mabinogion. It's a valley which has inspired writers and artists over the century. It was painted by David Cox in 1863, I think, and it is recognised, it's designated because of its special wildlife status. And for me, what's a really important point is that when the Welsh Government, when the Senedd declared a nature emergency, the Welsh Government changed planning law to say that the only development that should be allowed in SSSIs is that which is necessary to maintain the SSSI or in wholly exceptional circumstances. And the planning officer, in recommending that this be accepted, did not explain in any sense why this was wholly exceptional. And the thing is, I'm an environmentalist. I'm in favour hugely of decarbonising the economy. We need to do that. But this is going to make a minimal contribution. You know, it would take 12 schemes like this on 12 rivers to generate as much electricity as one major wind turbine, one large modern wind turbine. And really, to me, the only argument for it is that the landowners and their financial backers are going to make a lot of money. Mm-hmm. To me, that's not a good enough reason for destroying something which has been here for hundreds of years and which is really, really special.
The important thing about the whole Cwm is that it's so important in terms of our cultural heritage. And of course, cultural heritage by now is being recognised by different authorities. The 1995 Environmental Act recognised cultural heritage, and that made cultural heritage one of the purposes of the national parks. Not only landscape and scenery and so on, like, you know, but you know, the cultural heritage also is a crucial element in the purposes of the national parks, all of them. And this, of course, and the rest of the Cwm, you know, is very, very important in terms of not only the features, the geographical and ecological features, but then the Mabinogion and, you know, the old drove route coming down this way and everything else. And when we get down to the lower bits, I'll show you Pulpit Hugh Llwyd, that great big block in the middle of the river. And Hugh Llwyd was such an amazing character that, you know, the story about him there is absolutely mind-blowing, as you'll find out later on.
Waterfall further down?
Yeah. This is Rhaeadr y Cwm. You then go down to two other very dramatic falls. Those are Rhaeadr Cynfal, and then just down below that, just down below was Rhaeadr Ddu, the Black Falls. Yeah? And that goes into a very steep gorge and full of amazing bryophytes and so on, you know.
Can I say something, Rory?
Oh, go ahead.
I'm just going to say, you know, given we don't know exactly which species are living in the Caynach, because it's so inaccessible, that even the most recent survey that was carried out by Des Callahan, the environmental impact assessment, you know, no one can get into that canyon to do a survey unless they abseil in. That didn't happen. That wasn't resourced in the last environmental impact assessment. So we don't know exactly what species are living in there or how abundant they are. But I think it's really imperative that any proposed development operates under the precautionary principle, you know, where the value of nature conservation and biodiversity is really is not overlooked, but is held in the highest of importance. The Welsh Government has said that they are only making decisions based on evidence. So if the development was to go ahead here, then they would need to provide evidence that the ecology of the Cwm and the rare plant communities it supports here and up on the site of development, and both upstream and downstream, right the way to the sea, wouldn't be negatively impacted. And, you know, at the very least, I think this is an opportunity for us to push that NRW does a thorough survey of this SSSI, because it was designated way back in 1983, I think. And as far as I can see, there hasn't been a thorough, detailed survey of the Caynach to establish exactly what species are living in there and how abundant they are and how, you know, rare they are now. And they're likely, because there's been so many of these habitats have been impacted, and this one is still pretty much pristine, that the species that are in there are likely to be even more rare than they were when the bryologists first came here in the Victorian times and identified it as a place that was really important botanically.
environment.
Exactly. It's beautifully rare, and just to say that everything in there is doing its thing naturally on its own, uninterrupted, and to take 70% of the water out of it will make 70% change to the environment of it, and suggesting that it's such a beautiful thing and say let's just scrap it doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
Only if you're a capitalistic one.
Well, it's down to people that are making an awful lot of money out of the engineering of the project and the construction of the project, and that's all I can see that it's being pushed for.
So we're at the bottom of the waterfall here, and it's very important to notice that the Cwm Cynfal is a crucial and very important fish nursery for migratory fish in the area, like Atlantic salmon and sea trout, whose numbers are on a crazy decline over the past 2 decades or so. And considering that there are other hydro schemes across the Dwyraid catchment, and this is one of the last remaining high-quality spawning grounds for the fish, it's also important to notice the fact that the water will be diverted from the top of the waterfall down to here, and even though the water will be returned, the level of oxygen needed for these fish to be able to spawn and survive is crucial and detrimental. So overall, you do have to question the overall impact on rediverting the water flow and how much it will actually impact the environment, and is the gain really worth it? Yes, so the North Yorkshire River Trust have come out and done eDNA tests, so an environmental DNA test on the river, both downstream and upstream, to measure so we can detect what species are in the river. The main species. Sorry. Oh, speak up. Oh, sorry, my bad. The main species will be eel, so Cwm, and they're on the IUCN, yes, so International Union Conservation for Nature. They're red list, so the eels have been on it since 2018, and they're also another species that needs to be protected. And so there are claims that the eels have been able to make their way all the way to the top of the waterfall. With this hydro scheme, that could be at risk as well, because they do rely on small pools, and not just that, but also the invertebrates that can be affected by the reduced oxygen in the water and the reduced water flow. But then that food is not there, that food source for these species aren't there anymore. So you're really playing with the overall circle of life in this area. It all comes back to it really, and so so it's important to consider the big picture. It's mainly the downstream areas, the spawning grounds. So in the winter, these fish come back from the sea to because they remember the rivers that they were born in, so they'll come back. And however, they're intelligent creatures as well. If they know that the oxygen levels have changed, then they will probably find other routes, other rivers to spawn their eggs in.
Even with the information we've built here, it would have downstream impacts because of the oxygen levels in the water, and the sediment load and the flow regime, temperature profile could all be changed, which could have impacts downstream of the spawning grounds that would deter the salmon and the trout from coming up. So the salmon could potentially be spawning up here in this part of the river.
So you can probably see around here, and probably downstream there are gravels, and again they do rely a lot on well oxygenated water to help survive. And then not just that, but once the fish, they're born, they'll be needed to look for food. However, if there's no invertebrates there to eat the food, they won't survive, and obviously that's another threat for the population as well. And so again, you need to consider the big picture. There's a lot more to play, and
how would the invertebrate population be affected by?
Again, it's down to the oxygen levels of the water, the temperature, and not just that, but then the invertebrates also need food. So you talk about the spraying, the splashes helping with the lichen and whatnot around in the area. So again, it's a food source. It starts from the microbes really, and the lichen and yeah, and so the invertebrates would eat that, and there's a food for the fish, food for the eel, and so yeah.
In Bach, Cynta, talking about this route, yeah, this used to be not only a direct route, as it were, but a drove road as well. And of course, people would bring their cattle and sheep along from down below from the Mount Turog, but also from further around from Ganllwyd and Trawsfynydd and so on. And in fact, the great uncle of mine, I think I'm not sure if it was the late Victorian or early 20th century or whatever, but he would bring sheep up in this direction and up this route, and then turn up by Pontrefan Gamber and past the Ffynonneidda, yeah, you know Ffynonneidda where the road forks and so on, yeah. And Ffynonneidda, there was a tavern there, Tafarn y Mynydd, which was demolished completely at one stage, and the stones taken away to build a bridge or whatever, like, you know. But he came up this way and stayed overnight there on his way to Dyffryn Clwyd, which is quite a distance away. So this was a very, very important drove route. And of course you would go further over and down through, well, you know, over the Mycinau through to Ysbytyfan, and from there on, of course, you know, up towards Capel Curig and all these places, and out towards England or whatever. So this was a very, very important route, as a drove route as well as a means of communication as well, like, you know.
It's very important, but it does change over time. So you can't actually date a track. A track is just a track. So you can only date it by the features that you find alongside it. Cwm Farm is a late medieval house, and when you come up here, it's actually when the river goes around the bend there, there's a medieval farmstead up on the slightly higher ground now. So there's going to be a link between Cwm Farm and this land up here. Now, whether that medieval farmstead was a permanent farmstead, or whether it was a summer dwelling, the Havoti, because this is the Havod, the summer pasture, or more likely it started out as a permanent dwelling and then later became a summer dwelling when there was a slight retreat from higher ground. So there are times over history, in the early medieval period, the 11, 1200, 1300, people move up onto the hills because the climate is better. Black Death, worsening climate, people go back down. Then you get the 15th century when, after Glendower's rebellion, life gets harder for Wales. People looking for land and they'll come back up here again. Then in the Tudor period, things start to improve. People sort of retreat back down again. And so there's this always this advance and retreat from the hills until the end of the Victorian period, when everybody basically left, and that's where we are now. So I think that what we know is that there would have been a summer pasture up here for Cwm Farm. In 1845, when the tithe map was drawn, it's known as a sheep walk. A sheep walk is not the same as a havod. So the havod, the summer pasture, is where they bring the cattle and sheep up onto the hill, and it's as much about dairy as it is about wool. So you'll have women up here to milk cows, and sheep, of course, was a dairy animal for a long time. So that tends to die out in the early 19th century when you get mechanised woolen mills. Wales is a country, there's just woolen mills everywhere. You see a river, a stream, there's just there's bound to be a woolen mill on it somewhere. So Welsh farming slowly transitioned from being mixed cattle and sheep to being predominantly sheep. So when you see the hills now are predominantly sheep, that's really over the past 200 years that's happened. Before then, it was a mixture of cattle and sheep. Okay.
If you'd like to support the campaign to save Cwm Cynfal and its amazing waterfall, you can still officially object to the planning application at this website.